He was captivated. It was something new for him, something he had never felt with such intensity before. Love, in its purest and most overwhelming form, had taken hold of his thoughts and his heart, but there was something preventing him from fully giving in, something that kept him at a distance, creating a fine line between the desire to be with you and the fear of confronting a past that felt insurmountable. For him, life had always been a series of careful choices, decisions made based on values he considered unchangeable. He grew up in an environment where tradition and morality were fundamental pillars, and although his upbringing allowed him the freedom to explore his own feelings, he always believed that there were certain boundaries that should not be crossed. What set him apart from the people around him was his conviction that respect for norms was the foundation of any lasting relationship. When he met you, something changed within him. Your smile, the way your eyes sparkled when you talked about your passions, everything seemed to fit with the parts of his life he had always wanted to find. But there was something in your past that he couldn't ignore. Something that made him question whether he could be the person you deserved. He knew he shouldn't judge. Deep down he understood that people have different stories, and that each person's choices don't always reflect who they truly are. But the weight of a past so distant yet so present was becoming a difficult obstacle to overcome. He realized that there was something there, something he would have to face if he truly wanted to experience a love like the one he felt for you. And yet, the doubt consumed him. You didn't know, but he had already researched your history. Unintentionally, or rather, without knowing how to control himself, he found himself rummaging through the details of your past. Curiosity, though fueled by concern, led him to understand more than he perhaps should have. He discovered the relationships you've had, the decisions you've made, and everything that seemed to him to deviate from what he believed was the right path to love. He wasn't a rude person, nor was he incapable of seeing the nuances of a life that wasn't his own. However, he believed that a person's past, their choices and actions somehow shape who they are. And in your case, he couldn't ignore what he found. He thought, how can I fully trust you when your past seems so distant from everything I consider right? The problem wasn't just what he discovered, but what it represented to him. The idea that you had been involved with people who in some way contradicted everything he valued made him question his ability to accept a love like yours. He wanted to believe in you, wanted to see beyond what was right in front of his eyes, but his heart still wondered, can I really trust someone with a past so different from mine? These doubts were not easy to bear. He felt as if every moment by your side was a silent battle, where he found himself forced to weigh each word, each gesture, in search of signs that could give him the answer he so desperately sought. It was a cycle of love and judgment that left him exhausted, yet at the same time incapable of letting go. What could he do? How could he move forward with a love that seemed perfect, but was overshadowed by the shadow of the past? There were days when he believed that the only way to be truly happy was to free himself from the beliefs that limited him so much. But then, in a moment of clarity, he found himself back at that question mark, asking himself, what if all of this is a mistake? What if, in the end, I am the only one trying to impose barriers where they shouldn't exist? His love for you grew stronger each day, but the weight of his past still kept him bound to a place of doubts and insecurities. He wanted to be the kind of person who would accept the other without judgment, without looking for flaws. He wanted to be more open, more understanding, more willing to embrace whatever life threw his way. But his mind, tied to the values he had always carried, couldn't help but question every step, every movement. He knew that you deserved someone who loved you without reservations, someone who accepted you fully, without looking back. And he wanted to be that person. But the scars of his past were deeply rooted in his psyche. The conversations he had with others, the stories he was told, all seemed to confirm his deepest beliefs. We can't simply forget the past. But he wondered, does true love require us to let go of certain judgments? In the end, does the past really matter that much? There were moments when he imagined what his life would be like with you. He envisioned walking by your side, sharing laughter, joy, and even struggles. He imagined what the future would look like, a future where you would build something together. But those thoughts were always followed by a shadow, a persistent doubt that made him question whether he was truly the best for you. His greatest anguish wasn't the fact that you made different choices, but rather his own inability to free himself from the shackles that the past imposed on him. He saw love as something pure and unblemished, And his biggest fear was that this love would be tainted by something he couldn't accept. What he still didn't know was that love, in truth, isn't based on an ideal of perfection, but on a deep and unconditional acceptance of the other, with all their flaws and imperfections. He hadn't yet understood that a person's past does not define their worth as a human being, and that, contrary to what he believed, everyone's scars are part of their beauty and their story. There was something about you that he still didn't fully understand, something he would need to let go of in order to be able to give himself completely. And perhaps that was the greatest challenge of all, because in the end, his struggle wasn't against his past, but against his own beliefs. Only when he was able to look at you through the eyes of someone who truly loves, without the shadows of judgment, would he understand that true love has no fear of what lies behind. Sometimes the real turning point in a relationship doesn't occur when one accepts the other, but when one learns to accept oneself. When one recognizes that their own fears and insecurities are, for the most part, the biggest obstacles to overcome. And perhaps that is what he needs more than anything else, to learn to trust in love, not because it is perfect, but because it is real. He found himself in an internal conflict where the desire to be with you clashed with the limits he had set for himself over the years. The love he felt for you was not something superficial. It was an overwhelming passion, a longing to build something great and meaningful. But the weight of his past held him back from fully surrendering. Each time your eyes met, he felt like he was on the edge of a precipice, fearful of jumping but uncertain if he could come back if he did. He wondered if he could truly forget the scars of the past and allow his love to blossom, or if by doing so he would be sacrificing everything he believed to be right and safe. Was he, by accepting his past, opening the door to his own destruction? This doubt was constant, a shadow that accompanied him with every step. Yet there were also moments when he felt a lightness, a hope, as if the world was a simpler place with you by his side. He remembered the shared laughter, the small gestures of affection, the way your presence made him feel that maybe he could be more flexible, more open, more human. In his heart he knew that true love should not be conditional. But still he found himself questioning whether he was capable of offering unconditional love, given the burden of his judgment. He tried to rationalize his feelings, but the truth was that love, as he would soon realize, did not follow the rules of logic. It was something impulsive, something that could not be contained. The problem was not in your past, but in his own fear of failing, of being weak, of letting his principles crumble. He wanted you to be the kind of person he could proudly show off to others, someone who shared the same values and beliefs. But every time he tried to reconcile these ideas with how he felt about you, reality made him question, am I just seeking a version of you that fits my ideas, my worldview, instead of accepting who you really are? You never knew how much he was suffering because of this, how he wished he could love without limits, to look beyond mistakes, to understand that what truly matters is what a person becomes after facing the hardships of life. But the reality of his own fears was stronger than he wanted to admit. And as he tried to convince himself that he could overcome his own limits, the days went by, and he found himself further away than he ever imagined he could be. He wondered, am I the only one to blame for not being able to love fully? In a moment of quiet, while reflecting on all of this, he began to question, what if I'm depriving myself of true happiness? What if in seeking perfection, I'm just building barriers against the love I've longed for so much? He was afraid he was incapable of fully surrendering, of losing something that, deep down, he felt could be unique and wonderful. But the greatest fear was living a life of regrets, looking back and realizing that love passed him by, but he let it slip away because of a past that, in the end, didn't define who you truly were. The real challenge wasn't in accepting his past, but in opening his heart to the possibilities of the future. He still didn't know this. He was caught up in an internal battle that prevented him from moving forward. But little by little he began to understand that true love does not demand perfection. It requires understanding, patience, and the ability to see the other person honestly, without judgment, without chains. He needed to realize that love wasn't about correcting the mistakes of the past, but about looking toward the future together, with a willingness to grow and learn, not just as individuals, but as partners. And at that moment, he had a clear vision. He didn't have to conform to his own limitations. He needed to break free from them. The real turning point would be when he realized that by allowing himself to love, he wouldn't be denying his principles, but instead finding a new way to live, one that felt lighter and fuller of meaning. He didn't need to be perfect to love and to be loved. He didn't need a flawless past to build something beautiful in the present. When he finally allowed himself to see love through different eyes, his fears began to fade away. He understood that your past was not a sentence, but a story that was part of who you were, and that it was something he should accept, not to justify or excuse, but to understand. What he discovered then was that the wounds of the past were simply lessons that had been overcome, not a prison from which he needed to escape. True love required courage, but also humility, and he was ready to take that step. He wanted to be by your side, to build a future together, where fears and insecurities would be left behind. He wanted to understand that love didn't need justification, only presence and sincerity. He wondered now with less doubt if you would be willing to follow this path with him. He wanted to believe that by putting aside his own fears and limitations, he could surrender to love in a genuine and unreserved way. The only thing he knew was that to be happy, he needed to take the final step, to accept the other person as they are, with all their flaws, mistakes, and triumphs. He didn't need to search for a perfect love. He just needed to be able to love without fear. The true beauty of love, he realized, does not lie in the quest for perfection, but in the mutual acceptance of the imperfections that make each relationship unique. And finally, he understood that love has nothing to do with past choices, but with the willingness to walk together, with open hearts, towards a future full of possibilities. The decision was now his. Was he ready to let go of the bonds of judgment and surrender to what he felt, or would he continue to fight against what could be the greatest love of his life? Now he knew that true freedom lay in allowing himself to love, but to do that, he needed to learn to love himself first. He stood there, reflecting on everything he had learned, trying to decide if he was truly ready to make this change. The idea of accepting love without restrictions seemed simple at first glance, but the reality was that he had never been this vulnerable. He questioned whether he was prepared to give up a control that, until then, had provided him with security. But the truth was clear. He was imprisoning himself in a fear that prevented him from experiencing what could be the greatest love of his life. He knew there was something about you that made him want to take a risk, something beyond what appearances or the past could show. It was the way your eyes sparkled when you talked about the future, about dreams yet to come, and how he felt touched to realize that despite the difficulties, you were willing to build something new. He no longer wanted to live with the weight of a past that had no power over the present. Still, doubt lingered. He wanted to believe. He wanted to let go of the fear, but he didn't know if he'd be able to. The questions that haunted him grew ever more intense, and he wondered if his heart was ready to break free from what seemed to be a safe prison. Over time, however, he began to realize something important. Love doesn't require perfection, but rather the courage to surrender. It doesn't matter what the past has been. What truly matters is what is built in the present. He needed to trust his heart, the person in front of him, and more than anything, the possibility of a future that would be shaped by both of them. Now, he was almost ready. But for that, he needed to finally accept that the only barrier preventing him from being happy was himself. He was on the brink of a big decision, about to surrender to what he really felt. And you? Have you faced your own fears in the name of love? Sometimes the biggest barrier lies within ourselves. Share in the comments what you think. How far would you be willing to go for someone you love even when the past weighs heavy? Let's talk about it.